The dust devils danced across the main street of Cedar Ridge, spinning their wild ballet through the scorched afternoon air. It was the kind of day that made men pull their hats low and women clutch their shawls tight, though the heat pressed down like a flat iron on everything it touched. The year was 1870, and the frontier town sat stubborn on the edge of civilization, refusing to yield despite the harshness that surrounded it. Jacob Hart stood on the wooden platform of the train station, his calloused hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the empty tracks stretching eastward. The metal rails shimmered in the heat, creating mirages that looked like pools of water in the distance. He'd been standing there for the better part of an hour, his patience thinning as sweat trickled down his back beneath his work shirt. At 32, Jacob was what the frontier had made him, lean, weathered, and practical to his core. His face bore the marks of a man who'd seen too much sun and not enough mercy, with deep lines carved around gray eyes that had witnessed both beauty and brutality. He owned a modest ranch, 15 miles north of town, carved from stubborn land that fought him for every blade of grass and drop of water. For 3 years he had managed alone since Mary died of the fever. He'd buried her on a hill overlooking the creek, and since then silence had been his only companion. The ranch hands came and went, but they had families, and he had ghosts. When old Samuel at the general store mentioned the matrimonial agency back east, Jacob had listened with the same practical attention he gave to buying seed or selecting cattle. He'd written his letter carefully. Send a plain, hard-working woman, one who understands that frontier life ain't easy. I don't need beauty or fancy talk, just someone steady who can handle the work and the quiet. He'd sealed that letter with certainty, believing he knew exactly what kind of woman he needed, or thought he did. The train whistle broke the stillness, echoing through the hot air. Jacob straightened his shoulders, running a hand through his dark hair to smooth it down. He'd even worn his best shirt, the blue one with only 2 patches, and trimmed his beard that morning. A man should look respectable when meeting his bride, even if the marriage was more business than romance. The locomotive thundered into the station, hissing and clanking as it slowed to a stop. Steam billowed, mixing with the smell of coal and dust. Passengers began to step down. Merchants, families, travelers bound for distant ranches. Jacob scanned each face, searching for a woman who matched the picture in his mind. Plain dress, modest bonnet, maybe a worn carpet bag. Someone ordinary. Then he saw her. She stood on the steps of the train car, pausing as if the sun had struck her full in the face. But it wasn't the heat that made Jacob's breath catch. It was her. Her hair, instead of being neatly pinned beneath a bonnet, tumbled around her shoulders in waves, the color of wheat, wild and unrestrained. Her dress, deep green and travel-worn, clung to her slender form in a way that made her seem completely out of place in the dusty station, and her eyes. God help him, they were the color of honey touched by sunlight, scanning the platform with sharp, assessing awareness. When those eyes found his, Jacob felt something shift inside him, like a fence post giving way after years of holding firm. She descended the steps gracefully, but tightly, gripping the railing, betraying a nervousness her raised chin didn't show. A single carpet bag hung from her hand, the fine leather scuffed by travel. Jacob forced himself forward, boots thudding on the worn planks. "Miss Walsh," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mr. Hart," she replied, not as a question, but a fact. Her gaze held his, direct, unflinching. "I suppose you're disappointed." Jacob blinked. "Disappointed?" A faint smile touched her lips. "I read your letter to the agency. You requested someone plain. I fear I'm a terrible disappointment." For a moment, Jacob forgot to breathe. He'd expected meekness, maybe gratitude. Instead, this woman stood before him as though she were the one granting him a favor. "I expected a plain frontier bride," he managed, though the rest of his words faltered under her steady gaze. "Yes," she said calmly, lifting her carpet bag. "And I expected a great many things too, Mr. Hart. It seems we're both in for surprises." She looked around the dusty town, unimpressed. "Is it far to your ranch?" 15 miles. "Then perhaps we should go." "I've been on that train 5 days, and I'd very much like to stop moving. even if it means starting a new kind of journey. Jacob found himself wondering what kind of journey she meant, but he said nothing. He reached for her bag, their fingers brushing. Her hands were not soft, calloused slightly, capable hands. She met his eyes again, and something unspoken passed between them. "This way," he said quietly, leading her toward the wagon. The horses shifted restlessly, sensing the change. As he helped her climb up, he caught a faint trace of lavender soap mixed with the scent of the rails, and beneath it, something wilder, like sage after rain. She settled her skirt and turned to him. "Well, Mr. Hart, I believe we have a marriage to attend to before we leave town, unless frontier customs have changed since I last read about them." Jacob almost laughed. Almost. "The Justice of the Peace has an office above the general store." "Good," she said, her tone brisk, but her eyes held a flicker of uncertainty. As he climbed onto the bench beside her and took the reins, Jacob caught their reflection in the window of the bank. Him in his patched shirt and worn hat, her with that wild hair and fearless gaze. They looked mismatched, like a sparrow paired with a hawk. "Mr. Hart," she said softly, "are you having second thoughts?" He met her eyes. "No, Miss Walsh, though I'll admit, you're not what I expected." Her smile this time was genuine, and it transformed her face entirely. "Good," she said. "I found that expectations are rather like rules. They're made to be broken." Quote. As the wagon rolled toward the justice's office, Jacob Hart couldn't shake the feeling that the rules of his life, the careful order he'd built from grief and solitude, had just been rewritten by the woman beside him. And for the first time in 3 long years, he didn't mind one bit. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled out of Cedar Ridge, following the rutted trail north toward Jacob's ranch. The afternoon sun hung low and merciless, baking the earth until it shimmered in waves of gold. Dust rose behind the wagon like a long, fading ribbon. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his thoughts were anything but steady. Beside him sat the woman he had just married. Eleanor Walsh Hart now, though it still felt strange to think of her that way. Their vows had been simple, practical, spoken in the justice's office with the store clerk and his wife as witnesses. She had said, "I do," in a clear, unwavering voice. He'd noticed the slight tremor in her fingers only when he'd slipped the ring onto her hand. Since then, she'd said little, her gaze turned toward the horizon. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken things. Jacob stole a glance at her. She looked different in the shifting light. Her hair catching the sun in streaks of copper and gold, her jaw set in quiet resolve. He'd known plenty of women, but none quite like her. "It's beautiful," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice startled him. He followed her gaze to the endless plains stretching toward the distant mesas. "Most folks think it's too harsh," he replied. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Most folks prefer their beauty tamed. Gardens with neat fences. Mountains viewed from safe verandas. But this," she gestured at the wild land around them, "this is honest." Jacob studied her carefully. "You speak like someone who's known comfort and left it behind." Her lips curved, though her eyes darkened. "You're not wrong, Mr. Hart." "Jacob," he corrected quietly. She hesitated, then tried the name, Jacob. It came out softer than he expected, almost intimate. "My father owned a shipping company in Philadelphia. He had plans for me, plans I didn't agree with." "Let me guess," Jacob said dryly. "You refused to marry the man he picked?" Eleanor gave a humorless laugh. "A man twice my age, widowed twice already. My father thought it practical. I thought it prison. When I refused, he disowned me." Jacob didn't reply at once. He'd known women bound by duty and men who thought they could buy obedience with comfort. He understood running from the past. "So you answered a mail-order advertisement," he said finally. "I read your letter," she said. "It was honest. You wanted a partner, not a decoration. I thought perhaps we could make a life out of honesty." Jacob gave a low chuckle. "The agency said you were of gentle temperament." "I paid the clerk to write that," she admitted, and the corners of his mouth twitched despite himself. "You're bold, I'll give you that." Bold or foolish, she said lightly. I suppose we'll find out. The land began to change as they rode on, the flat plains giving way to low hills dotted with pines. A thin creek glimmered in the distance, marking the edge of Jacob's property. He pointed ahead. There, that's home. Eleanor leaned forward, studying the scene. The ranch house stood in a shallow valley, its log walls silvered by sun and time. Cottonwoods lined the creek, their leaves whispering in the breeze. A barn stood nearby, and 2 dogs raced from its shadow, barking as the wagon approached. It's perfect, she murmured. Jacob blinked, certain she was mocking him. It's plain, he said. 2 rooms, maybe 3 if you count the lean-to kitchen, no fancy furniture or lace curtains. I didn't come for lace, she replied simply. He stopped the wagon beside the porch and helped her down. The dogs circled, sniffing curiously until Jacob spoke. Easy, boss. Easy, lady. Eleanor knelt, holding out her hand. Lady, a scrappy shepherd mix, wagged her tail hesitantly before accepting the gesture. Eleanor smiled, her face softening in a way Jacob hadn't seen before. They're beautiful, she said. They're workers, like everything else here, Jacob replied, lifting her carpet bag. They earn their keep. I expect I'll have to do the same, she said lightly. Jacob glanced at her, half expecting to see sarcasm, but her tone was matter-of-fact. She meant it. Inside, the house was simple but clean. The scent of wood smoke lingered from the morning's fire. Eleanor moved slowly through the room, touching the rough-hewn furniture, the tools on the wall, the small shelf of books by the window. She stopped at the Bible, tracing its worn spine. You read? She asked softly. When there's time, Jacob said, suddenly defensive. Long winters leave a man with little else to do. I'm glad, she said sincerely. Books make a home feel alive. He watched her move to the window, sunlight washing over her face. She looked out toward the distant hills, and for a moment, Jacob wondered what she saw. Hope or regret? I'll see to the horses, he said roughly, needing something to do with his hands. There's water if you want to wash up. When he returned, dusk had settled, painting the cabin in soft amber light. Eleanor had changed into a simple brown skirt and white blouse. Her hair was braided, but stubborn strands framed her face. She stood at the stove, coaxing a flame to life. I thought I'd try to make coffee, she said, glancing over her shoulder. Though I've read more about it than I've done it. Coffee's simple, Jacob said, hiding a smile. Just don't boil it to death. They cooked together in silence, moving around each other awkwardly at first, then with surprising ease. Dinner was beans, cornbread, and canned peaches. Nothing fancy, but she ate with quiet gratitude. When the plates were cleared, the house settled into the hush of night. Coyotes cried in the distance. The dogs stirred but didn't bark. Jacob leaned back in his chair, watching Eleanor across the flickering lamplight. You worked hard today, he said. So did you. He hesitated. Eleanor. She met his eyes steadily. I know my duties as a wife, she said softly, but I also know love and partnership take time. I'd like to start with respect, if that's agreeable to you. Quote, Jacob felt something in his chest unclench, something that had been wound tight for 3 long years. Time, he said quietly, is something we have plenty of. She smiled then, small but real. Good. Then we'll start with that. As she disappeared into the small bedroom, Jacob stretched out on a cot by the fire. Through the thin wall, he could hear her moving, the soft rustle of fabric, the splash of water, the sigh of exhaustion. He stared at the ceiling, the firelight dancing over the beams. For the first time in years, his house wasn't silent. For the first time, the loneliness didn't feel endless. He'd asked for a plain, practical bride. Instead, he'd been sent a woman who carried the wild in her eyes and strength in her bones. And though he didn't yet know if that would save him or ruin him, Jacob Hart couldn't help but think, maybe, just maybe, it would make him alive again. The weeks that followed turned into a slow rhythm of survival, work, and something that might have been trust. Each morning, Eleanor rose before sunrise, the smell of coffee already drifting through the cabin. She fed the chickens, watered the garden, and learned the small rituals that kept a ranch alive. Jacob watched from a distance at first, certain she would tire or falter, but she didn't. He'd married her expecting to carry the weight of 2 lives, and instead found her beside him in every task. When a fence line needed mending, she held the posts steady. When the cattle broke through the lower pasture, she rode with him to drive them back, hair whipping loose in the wind, her face fierce and alive. She worked until her hands blistered and her skin darkened from the sun, and though she moved stiffly at night, she never complained. If Jacob offered to help, she met his concern with a teasing look and said, "You wanted a partner, didn't you?" One morning, as the dawn light spilled over the hills, Jacob saddled Pepper for her first proper riding lesson. Eleanor stood in borrowed trousers cinched with rope, her braid coming undone, determination in her eyes. "Your father would have fainted if he saw you like this," Jacob said, unable to keep a grin from his face. "He fainted often," she said dryly, and Jacob laughed outright, the sound echoing across the quiet valley. She was clumsy at first, but fearless. When the mare reared slightly, Eleanor steadied her with a calm voice and a firm hand. By the second hour, she was riding circles around the corral. When she dismounted, her cheeks were flushed and her smile was wide. "You're a natural," Jacob said. Eleanor wiped her brow with her sleeve. "I've been reading that horses respond to energy. They sense fear." Jacob nodded. "Out here, that's true of everything. Horses, weather, even people." The moment hung between them, quiet and charged. She held his gaze longer than usual, and he looked away first, pretending to check the saddle straps. By afternoon, trouble came riding. 4 men appeared on the ridge above the ranch, their silhouettes dark against the sun. Jacob's body stiffened before he could even see their faces. He knew their leader by the slouched posture and wide-brimmed hat. Frank Dalton, owner of the Double D Ranch. Dalton had been circling like a buzzard for years, buying out smaller spreads through intimidation or deceit. Jacob had refused to sell, and since then, bad luck had a way of finding him. Cattle gone missing, fences cut, water rights questioned. Dalton and his men rode down slow, like they owned the place. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, the dogs growling low at her feet. "Inside," Jacob said quietly. "I'm not hiding," she replied, her chin high. Dalton reined in his horse at the gate, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Hart," he drawled. "Heard you got yourself a new wife. Couldn't stay lonely forever, huh?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "You're trespassing." "Just being neighborly," Dalton said, his tone oily. "Thought I'd welcome your bride proper-like." His eyes drifted toward Eleanor, and something dark flickered there. "Pretty thing. Doesn't quite fit the frontier, does she?" Jacob stepped forward, his voice cold. "You speak to her again, Dalton, and you'll regret it." Dalton chuckled, but his eyes narrowed. "Careful, Hart. Be a shame if your water supply ran dry this summer. You know how accidents happen." "My water rights are legal," Jacob said. "Courts are far away," Dalton replied. "Accidents are close." The air between them tightened until it felt like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Eleanor could feel it, could almost taste the violence pressing close. Jacob didn't flinch. "You've said your piece," he said finally. "Now get off my land." Dalton smirked, touched his hat in mock courtesy, and turned his horse. "You'll be seeing me, Hart, sooner than you think." When they disappeared over the ridge, Jacob lowered his rifle but didn't relax. "Who was that?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Trouble," he said simply. "Frank Dalton. Thinks the whole valley belongs to him." "He's dangerous," she said. "So am I," Jacob answered, but his voice was weary. "He'll push. Men like him always do." That night, they worked side by side, securing the barn and locking the gates. Eleanor could sense his worry beneath the calm. When he checked his rifle for the 5th time, she touched his arm. "I'm not afraid," she said. "If that's what you're thinking." Jacob looked at her, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You should be." "I've been afraid before," she said softly. But fear never stopped me from doing what needed to be done. His gaze lingered on her, this woman who'd ridden across half a country to start over, who refused to be tamed by fear or expectation. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was small, but it carried something unspoken, something that had been building between them since the train station. "You're not what I asked for," he said, voice low. "No," she whispered, "but maybe I'm what you needed." He didn't argue. He just looked at her a moment longer before turning away, his heart pounding harder than it had during Dalton's visit. The next morning, before dawn had burned the mist off the grass, he left to check the cattle in the far pasture. Eleanor watched him ride out, a dark figure against the pale light. She felt the weight of his absence more than she expected. By mid-morning, the valley was silent except for the wind. She was in the garden when she heard the distant thunder of hooves. Too many, too fast. Her heart leapt. She ran to the porch, rifle in hand. Dust rose beyond the ridge, and through it she saw riders. Not Jacob, not friendly. Dalton's men. Her hands trembled, but she remembered Jacob's voice. "Center mass. Squeeze. Don't pull." She stood her ground as the riders approached, her breath sharp in her chest. But before she could decide whether to fire, another sound broke through. Gunfire echoing from the south, shouts carried on the wind. The riders wheeled their horses, retreating toward the canyon. Eleanor's knees went weak, but she held herself upright until the sound faded. The dogs barked, restless, until the thunder of hooves returned. Slower this time. Jacob. He dismounted in one motion, crossing to her, eyes scanning for danger. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands still shook. "Dalton's men. They came close." "I know," Jacob said grimly. "We caught them running cattle off the Morrison place. They won't try that again soon." She reached for him without thinking, her palm against his chest, feeling the hard thud of his heartbeat. He covered her hand with his, rough fingers warm and sure. In that moment, the walls between them fell, the careful restraint, the distance. She saw everything in his eyes, the fear, the gratitude, the longing he'd tried so hard to hide. "I thought I'd lost you," he said quietly. "You almost did," she whispered. "But I'm here." He didn't answer. He just pulled her close and kissed her, slow and certain, like a man claiming something sacred. When they finally broke apart, the world outside felt quieter somehow. The danger still real, but no longer defining them. Life on the frontier would never be easy. There would always be drought, rustlers, and gossip from the town. But as Jacob and Eleanor stood there, the sun sinking behind the cottonwoods, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: they'd face it together. He'd expected a plain frontier bride. Instead, he'd found a woman with a wild heart and a strength that matched the land itself. And somewhere between the dust and the danger, Jacob Hart realized the truth. Her wild beauty hadn't just shattered his rules, it had tamed his soul.